I am so alert to this enemy that we are facing. Now, I will tell you that I've spent most of my career in the region of the world that we're still engaged in. And so many of you maybe only caught it in the news, or some of you, probably most of you don't know, but there's an ongoing coup going on in Turkey right now. Right now, there's a coup. Yeah, and I was just literally going back and forth with a very great friend of mine who trained with us in the Turkish military. And the Turkish military is I don't know whether they're going to succeed or not, but the Turkish military, anybody that's switched on and paying attention, they have been just excised for many years by what really became a secular country, meaning a sort of a regular sort of nation state, and then began to move towards Islamism. This is Turkey under Erdogan, who is actually very close to President Obama. So I'm going to be very fascinated to see what happens, because if the military succeeds, and one of the things that came out of the military tonight, they're about plus 8 hours from here, so it's probably around 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning there. One of the things that the military immediately said is, we recognize our responsibilities with NATO, we recognize our responsibilities with the United Nations. We want to make sure that the world knows we want to be seen as a secular nation. This is the military. So, yeah, that is what's happening. President al-Sisi, who you saw up here, I served in 2007 and 2008 at U.S. Central Command, which is the command that takes care of the Middle East. And I was the head of intelligence at that time. President al-Sisi was the director of intelligence, the DMI, director of military intelligence, at the exact same time. So he and I were actually colleagues together. We got to know each other. We worked very closely together. The guy he's another one that has trained for almost 30 years of his career right here in the good old United States of America. So we have to be very precise. I say Islam is a political ideology that hides itself behind this thing they want to call as a religion. I mean, when you have the president of a country, President al-Sisi, who is calling for essentially a reformation, a revolution, in his words, in the Islamic world, he called for a year and a half ago. We should have embraced him. We should have jumped on that. Instead, we pushed him away. I mean, his words almost verbatim was, should we expect 1.7 billion members of the Muslim world to kill the other 7 billion? That was almost verbatim. He said it at a place called the Al-Azhar Mosque, which is essentially the Vatican of the Muslim world in Cairo.
One of the things we have to come to grips with is we and frankly the international community have to really focus on discrediting the ideology. That's number two. Number one is recognizing exactly what it is, which our current administration, President Obama, does not allow us to do that, in the government at least. Well, the use of the word radical Islam, or the phrase radical Islam, is not allowed in government. So,
well, let's draw on that for just one moment. And you've been over there, you've served in the Middle East. Yeah. Now we know that these terrorists, do they respect that President Obama is being politically correct, or how do they take
They laugh at it. It's laughable. And many Muslims that are actually trying to help also see it as a disservice to them, because they see it as hey, don't treat us like children. We know what it is. This is a cancerous, barbaric form inside of our bloodstream, and we know it has to be rooted out, but we need the United States to help. So, the number one is to clearly identify it, clearly define it. Number two is to really begin to work on discrediting it, discrediting the ideology, just like we did against communism or fascism last century.
And would that be by doing something like a Radio Free America and
beyond that? I mean, the Islamic State, and then previously to that, the Al Qaeda offshoot, Al Qaeda in Iraq, they're on, I think it's number 14 of their magazines. So this Dabiq magazine, they have a daily like TV show or a daily media event that's called Al-Amaq. Al-Amaq is like their headline news. It's like their CNN.
Okay.
They put it out every day. So it has to be in a different form. Radio Free Europe is in the way that was done is something in the past. It was useful, last century. This century is much different. It has to be a different form of warfare. In the book, I talk about Facebook and Twitter, and in some cases what they're not doing. And I think that they can do a lot more. There has to be a very positive message positive in a way that shows this ideology for what it is and what it is not. That's sort of number one. The third component is to create what I describe as a new 21st century alliance, and that alliance would consist of Muslim nations, because we're not going to get Iran to play fair. So this is where Russia comes in, because I talk a lot about Russia in here, and Russia's sort of I'm very uncomfortable with Russia and what Russia's doing. I've been told the Russians that they have to get Iran to back out. But this 21st century alliance is an alliance where you bring the Muslim nations together, the leaders. So like President al-Sisi, out of Egypt, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, which is Mohammed bin Salman.
What about countries
Jordan?
What about Indonesia? I mean,
Indonesia too. Yeah, Indonesia too. Singapore is actually doing some good work. Indonesia must be brought into this as well. So essentially from Indonesia to Morocco, but there is a tighter shot group where these nations are willing to provide capabilities. They're willing to provide boots on the ground, but they don't know how to organize themselves. They don't know how to lead this type of a coalition. And in a way, if you were to use an analogy, it would be like a sort of an Arab NATO-like, organization. I mean, in a way, people understand NATO, but a new type of one, yeah. And one where the Arab nations have to take some responsibility. They have to be held accountable. They have to step up to the plate.
Egypt's having the damnedest time right now. And we should put al-Sisi on a pedestal. Honestly, I mean, we should, because it's like the guy is like, he recognizes it for what it is. Now, why? Maybe he spent a lot of time in the West. Maybe because he's got a decent education. Maybe because he's just a guy that gets it. But he recognizes that, hey, and frankly, as I've said very publicly, Egypt is one bullet away from total anarchy. Total anarchy. Al-Sisi gets assassinated, which I know that he's got a massive protection around him. But if he goes, there's not some other guy behind him. There's some other people, but there's not somebody like him. That's a problem. It's a problem in that region sometimes, where you don't build, like Israel builds leaders. They invest in their future. These countries, they don't. They steal. So they steal from their future. So a guy like al-Sisi, he recognizes that to a degree, and I think that others, the monarchies have a difficult time, and they have to invest in their future. I think that what happened, back to your question, I think that what happened was a smart decision because they looked at the future. They looked at a 30-year-old kid that could be around for 60 more years. Because he comes from a line that actually lives a long time. They look at that, okay? So maybe he'll be around till he's 90, and he can take Saudi into a new direction. I hope. I mean, I'm hopeful of that. I'm actually talking to a lot of these folks in that country, encouraging them to think like that, and I hope that they do. But
you are challenging a nation. So like Kuwait or the UAE or the Saudis or Egypt or any one of them. You're challenging them to take a hard look at their entire system, their entire ecosystem. Because if they want to have their religion, their quote-unquote religion, and they want to have their security, and they want to pretend like they're like they have women's rights, you know, and they pretend like they have, like everything's fine, you know, then, you know, and I can tell you it's not.
Yeah.
So one example, and I don't want to say too much about this book, but one example I talk about in the book is in 2015, there were more books translated in Spain that year, in 1 year, translated into Spanish, than there were books translated in the Arab world for the last 1,000 years. Okay? So 1,000 years ago, the Arab world would have had all of the Nobel Prizes, science, art, peace. They had gotten them all 1,000 years ago. So what changed was this guy Muhammad comes into play, and honestly, we're dealing with a text that is ancient and not helpful, and a society that lives on that text, and it can't come to grips with modernity, with becoming modern.
I fully intend on buying the book. Can you give us an idea, a little prelude to what your plans are to defeat the ideology?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things is that, and I start with this, and this really goes after being able to attack the ideology, discredit the ideology. I mean, we still have to do some military operations and the kinds of things that we're doing, but this doesn't mean, you know, more boots on the ground, because I always get asked that question. One of the things that I call for in the book is the creation of a new 21st century alliance. Rabbi Hausman mentioned President al-Sisi of Egypt. President al-Sisi is a good friend of mine. I've known him for a long time. He and I we were colleagues when I was the senior intelligence officer at U.S. Central Command down in Tampa. We had responsibility for East Africa, the Middle East, and Central Asia. And al-Sisi was the head of intelligence at that time in the Egyptian military. So he and I became friends, actually. And what I felt like we should have done was we should have embraced him when he gave his great intellectually courageous speech at the Al-Azhar Mosque at the end of about a year and a half ago, beginning of 2015, end of 2014. And Al-Azhar Mosque, for people that don't know, it's kind of like the analogy is sort of like the Vatican of the Muslim world. And first time a Muslim leader of a country ever spoke in front of that, other than an imam or a cleric. So he stood there, and we did not embrace him. We should have embraced him. One of the things that I call for is a new 21st century alliance, and principally putting the burden on the backs of the Arab world. And al-Sisi was calling for that. So there's some steps that we're trying to take right now, actually in the political process, to try to get this idea in place. It will exist. It will exist. Trust me, it will exist, because we have to, the Arab world has to take more responsibility for what's happening. But in order to get there, they're going to need U.S. leadership. But the idea of discrediting the ideology, we spent 40 years discrediting the ideology of communism. 40 years.
Because that's, to a degree, that's what's happened in the Middle East, where we're dealing with one, you know, we're feeding weapons into one group, and all of a sudden they turn against us and they join the bad guys.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's where we saw, you know, the weapons going through Benghazi, through Qatar first, then Turkey, and then on into Syria. And I think that's a big problem, because now we're fighting our own weapons. So I think that that's a big issue. That is something, do you think that Pentagon can take care of?
No, these are things. I mean, Pentagon would maybe, you know, do the mechanics of it. They might work the mechanics of how it functions. But this is really a bigger decision. Because am I giving you a weapon, you know, or I'm giving you a weapon for what end, for what purpose? So I give you something because I want you to do something with it. I want you to achieve something by whatever it is that I'm giving you. I want you to have an outcome. So what's the outcome? If I'm at a very tactical level, the outcome is a very tactical outcome. And that's all we are thinking about. We have no strategic thinking going on right now. What I would rather have is a real strategic discussion about what is it that we are trying to achieve. What are our overarching goals? Is it the defeat of radical Islam? It has to be beyond that. And this is where this alliance of nations, they have got to get their act together. Because if they don't get their act together, we will eventually go to a larger war. So we will have a larger war, and others will be consumed by that larger war, because we cannot continue to have these types of attacks where and this installation of fear in the West.
I mean, I remember as a kid talking, about communists, right, in school and what it meant and what we had to do as a kid growing up. We can't talk about radical Islamism in our school system. I mean, you'd be thrown out, you'd be suspended, you'd be sent home, and then you as parents with your kids, people would be wondering about you. You'd be called names. We can't have that. We are facing another ism, just like we faced Nazism and fascism and imperialism and communism. This is Islamism, and it is a vicious cancer inside the body of 1.7 billion people on this planet, and it has to be excised. So, and we should not fear this idea. We should define it clearly, and we should go after it.